You know who makes great content? Tehsnakerer. This is the second time I've showed his videos on this channel. One of the series he covers is Watch Dogs, and his video on Watch Dogs Legion has a really great preamble where he vents his frustrations about Ubisoft as a developer. Good stuff. It's something I've always wanted to say, but never found the words to put on paper. Thing is, he and I go about Ubisoft differently. Where Snake is disappointed and despondent over Ubi's homogeneous design and toothless political astroturfing of concepts to market their hot topic edginess, I love Ubisoft to bits because of how tone-deaf they are as a company. Whatever the scenario, I can rest easy knowing that modern-era Ubi will always find a way to shoot themselves in the foot. Is the US government falling apart? Come see what a real government shutdown looks like in Tom Clancy's The Division 2. However, I'll admit that the comedy that Ubi constantly generates comes at the expense of the quality of games it used to pump out. I love the Splinter Cell series, and hearing talk that a new Splinter Cell is under development does not fill me with excitement or hype, especially with how Conviction and Blacklist turned out. And this is coming from a guy who deadass loves Conviction. My other favorite Ubisoft series is Prince of Persia. I grew up on Sands of Time. I played the hell out of that game back in high school. I could solve the one security system puzzle in the early chapters by sheer memory back then. A while back, there was an announcement for a Sands of Time remake, and I gotta say, it looks bad. I don't know how companies like Purple Lamp and General Arcade are able to put out good-looking remakes and faithful remasters of old titles that they didn't even originally work on, but all Ubi has to do is upscale the textures on Sands of Time, a game they made in 2003, and bring it to modern resolutions and frame rates. But then we get this. But I'm not here to hate on a game that isn't out yet, and is probably in the early stages of development, because, hey, they might rework the art style to be more faithful to the original. Or they'll stay on brand as Ubisoft, and find a way to put NFTs into the game. Anyways, Prince of Persia, Sands of Time is a 2003 action platformer by Ubisoft. You play as a prince of Persia. He just wants to impress his dad without having to kill a bunch of people during their campaign in India. So the prince goes off into the Maharaja of India's treasure vault, finds an ornate dagger kept in an awkward-to-reach display stand, and notices that he now has the power to reverse time.
Sand.
Yeah, this would totally impress anyone. While the king of Persia is enjoying the spoils of war, the vizier who betrayed the Maharaja suggests that the prince use his newfound dagger on the giant hourglass with the matching dagger slot. In hindsight, that may have been a bad idea.
Is it meant to do this?
The prince releases the Sands of Time, and now everyone who isn't wearing some kind of protective charm has turned into sand zombies. It's up to the prince and his newfound special lady Farah
She's not my special lady, she's my fucking lady friend. I'm just helping her conceive, man.
to work together to undo the vizier's evil plan. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Sands of Time is an almost perfect game. It's got a simple plot that carries the game forward, and the focus is always on the rapport that the prince and Farah develop over the course of the campaign. The prince has two modes, platforming and combat. By default, he's always in platforming mode. He can leap across gaps, latch onto climbing points, drop from climbing points, jump off of climbing points, climb up ladders and columns, jump off of columns, rotate on which side of the ladder he's climbing. That one is especially cool for all the unique platforming challenges that the game offers, and wall kick between two walls to get to either higher or lower ground. One of the big features that the game showed off in its marketing is the prince's maneuverability, specifically his wall running mechanic. If the prince is running towards a wall dead on, hold down R1 to make him run vertically up the wall. If the prince runs toward the wall at an angle, hold down R1 and the prince will run along the wall up to a certain point when gravity takes over. This was 1 year before Team Ninja dropped the first 3D Ninja Gaiden, where Hayabusa could automatically wall run without having to hold down any shoulder buttons. And you had to make good use of the prince's movement, because the castle that makes up 90% of the game's setting is an ocean nightmare. Not just for the fact that the sands destroyed most of the solid ground in the castle, but because the guy in charge was a crazy person who had a security system full of buzzsaws and spinning blades hidden around every corner. Whenever the prince enters a new area, the camera does a sweep over the entire section to show the player how to progress. It's great because it gives the game a cinematic flair it otherwise wouldn't have. Most platforming challenges require the prince to activate a switch. That switch opens a door on the far side of the level, and the prince has a limited time to make his way past all the hazards and get through the door before he's locked out and has to do it all over again. If the prince screws up, no worries, he's got the Dagger of Time at his disposal. Holding down L1 activates the dagger's rewind function. On the game's HUD, there's a circle that's constantly drawing itself. That circle is a timer that shows how long a rewind will last. Sometimes it can screw you over and not give you enough time after death to be in a safe state. Nothing you can do about that except restart the level from the nearest checkpoint. More on that later. Whenever the prince uses the dagger, it consumes a charge on one of the sand tanks on the dagger. To refill that tank, we need sand. But where are we going to get sand? That's where the sand zombies in combat come in. To mix up the gameplay, the prince needs to eliminate all the enemies in a room before he can progress. Sand zombies are hardy foes, and they can teleport wherever they feel like it. They hit hard and like to swarm the prince, so how do we deal with them? Press square and the prince will draw his blades. Keep pressing square to do sword combos. There's a rhythm of sorts to the combat, but it's not too hard to figure out how to chain combos. When an enemy goes down, press triangle near them to perform a finishing move with a dagger. You need to use a dagger on every downed enemy, or else they'll recover and you need to drop them again. Holding R1 while in combat mode will cause a prince to block. If an enemy attacks a prince, he can parry that attack with either his sword or dagger. If he uses his sword, he knocks the enemy down for a finishing blow. If he uses his dagger, he can absorb the enemy without having to knock them down. Parrying is very risky in this game if you're not good at the timing. A safer alternative is to press X near an enemy. The prince will vault over the enemy and out of harm's way. While vaulting, the prince can slash at the enemy with a sword by pressing square during the vaulting animation. I know I just made the game's combat sound really intricate and technical, but here's what you'll be doing for 90% of the combat. Enemies surround the prince. The prince vaults over each enemy and slashes at them to drop them. Then the prince stabs each downed enemy with his dagger to absorb their sand. Rinse and repeat. Eventually, stronger enemy types get mixed in with the regular mobs. These guys are designed to be hard counters to the vault cheese strategy, but these enemies have their own weaknesses. The chain-wielding enemies like to guard against the prince's sword attacks when he's vaulting, but they're weak against his wall vault attack. Press X near a wall, and the prince will briefly stick to it. Press X again, and the prince will launch himself even higher than he normally does with the vault. Slashing against the chain wielders during this maneuver causes enough damage to knock them down faster. The blue guards are susceptible to the wall charge attack. Press X near a wall like you would for the wall vault, but this time, press square while on the wall to cause the prince to propel himself like a bullet towards the nearest enemy. This is guaranteed to knock down blue guards. The prince doesn't have to just rely on his sword during combat. He can also use the dagger's time powers. Next to the sand tanks on the HUD are combo-looking shapes called power tanks. As the prince absorbs more sand from enemies, he creates more power tanks to go along with his regular sand tanks. Using the dagger's offensive powers consumes a power tank. Tapping L1 activates slowdown. Everyone, including the prince, moves slower than usual. It's good to get some hits on enemies that like to guard, but I've never found it that useful. If the prince is surrounded by enemies, press triangle to stab a standing enemy with a dagger. This freezes them in the air and allows the prince to do a finishing move on the zombie. It's good for deleting certain enemies from a fight, but the freezing effect is on a timer, so make sure you finish the job or else the enemy will recover. If the prince is taking too much damage during a fight, hold down L1 to activate rewind. Same rules apply in combat as you do in platforming when it comes to the timer. No matter what enemy type the prince is facing, they're all susceptible to his ultimate move, Zawarudo. If the prince has a full set of sand and power tanks, press L1 and R1 together to freeze every enemy in the map, as if the prince had stabbed them with a dagger. Now all he has to do is press the left stick in the direction of any enemy, and the prince will warp there. Press square to have the prince slice up the enemy like he would with his basic freeze attack. This is a powerful move, but you only have it available when you have the same number of sand and power tanks, and they all have to be full of sand. There's a good chance that the prince isn't going to come out of every fight or platforming challenge unscathed. Good thing he follows the r/HydroHomie subreddit. Press R1 near any body of water, and the prince takes an effing sip, babe. The camera pushes in, and desert level music starts playing to really show how important it is to stay hydrated. There are only 2 collectibles to keep an eye out for in this game. Every now and then, the prince will find secret passages that lead to a chamber with a magic fountain. Drinking from this has the same effect as that one water fountain in school that's way too cold for your teeth to handle. The game gaslights him into thinking that the magic fountain area doesn't exist, and his health bar gets a slight increase. You'll know right away if you found one of these because they're decorated with transparent drapery to give off an ethereal feel in the game. The other major collectible are sand clouds. These things are scattered everywhere in the palace. The prince can absorb them into his dagger by pressing triangle. Absorbing one sand cloud refills all the sand and power tanks on the dagger. Absorb enough sand clouds and the prince gains 1 extra sand tank. There's no way to adjust difficulty in the game settings, so the only way to make the game harder would be to avoid all the upgrades during a run. I remember going fountainless for a run back in the day, and it's perfectly viable. As the game progresses, the prince can upgrade his sword to more powerful versions. This results in requiring less hits to drop enemies, but it also allows the prince to break open weak walls. The prince can get 3 sword upgrades, with the last one having the ability to one-shot every enemy. These aren't really collectibles, but whenever the prince approaches a save point, he experiences visions of the next area. It's a really cool way to prepare the player for the upcoming challenge. Coming back to the game after so many years, I can say that Sands of Time is the Uncharted of its day, and that it did the fake out the player during platforming segments by making nearby ledges fall apart, well before the Uncharted games. More importantly, both titles are fun, pulpy adventures that feature a lovable rogue as a protagonist and his lady friend who helps him progress but is tired of his BS. Farah operates on her own AI, but she makes herself known. She's slim enough to slip through cracks in the walls where the prince couldn't fit, and the game does a great job making her feel integral to the player's progress. During combat, she fires arrows at enemies to soften them up for the prince to finish off. However, she's vulnerable to enemy attacks, and the prince needs to make sure she's safe from harm. He also needs to make sure he's not in her line of fire when she draws her bow. Friendly fire is always active around Farah. I like the chemistry between the prince and Farah. They have a rough start as she was a daughter of the Maharaja that the prince and his father just conquered, but they both understand the severity of the situation and put their differences aside. The prince starts off really full of himself and expects Farah to treat him with some respect. It's almost as if he thinks he's royalty or something. But eventually, they warm up to each other and it feels like a natural progression between the two. You can even hear it in their exchanges during the quieter portions of the game.
If you have believed the rest of my tale until now, perhaps you will also believe me when I tell you that, as we made our way through the moonlit ruins, I began to feel strangely drawn to the girl at my side.
The running joke in the game is that as more time passes in the palace, the prince takes on more clothing damage. He starts off completely covered up and ends up missing his shirt by the end of the game. It's a visual indicator to mark his progress and to show how desperate his situation has become. Speaking of visuals, this game's art style holds up. I said before in my video for Sable that I think games with stylized aesthetics last longer than photorealistic graphics, and this is one of the examples I look to when I say that. The characters all cut a unique silhouette, and their FMV models are all very expressive. I'm not sure if the original Prince of Persia was training on the prince-princess vizier dynamic that everyone knows from Disney's Aladdin, but I tend to think of Sands of Time as what I would have wanted a 3D Aladdin game with its look and setting. Whenever a combat section ends, the camera cuts to a full shot of the prince sheathing his blades. It's meant to signal the player that the fight is over, but it also shows off how dynamic the prince's model is as the player can see his various stages of undress. The music fits the tone of the game. It's got them desert sounds like you'd expect, but they've also got a groovy mix for the most part. The combat music starts off very chill in the early game, but as the stakes raise, it gets more and more pumped up. I think it's cool how, despite all the fantastic elements in the game, it tries to keep every mechanic diegetic to its setting. The story is framed in a way that the prince is telling it to an unknown listener. When the prince dies and doesn't have any sand to undo his mistake, the game over screen appears with the prince saying,
That's not how it happened. That didn't happen.
When the prince approaches a save point and receives visions, Farah points out how long he's been out and shows concern. But after a while, she gets used to his fainting spells and waits for him to recover. As the prince finds more entrances to the magic fountain, he becomes less awed by it, the more familiar he becomes to its presence. As much as I would love to gush about Sands of Time for this entire video, I do have to point out that this game is showing its age now. The first time I tried making this video, I was playing it on my 360. I could put up with a 4:3 aspect ratio, but the game was suffering some serious slowdown that threw off my timing. Reluctantly, I decided to play the game on PC. I bought the Prince of Persia bundle on GOG a while back, but never got around to installing them. Turns out I had a good reason, because a PC port of a 2003 console game does not like to work with wireless controller settings. Rather than trying to wrangle a joy-to-key on that version, I got the same bundle on Steam, and found some big picture mode controller settings for the game. The platforming still holds up, which is good because that's 70% of the gameplay. I wish I could say the same for combat. It's not terrible, but it feels sluggish in 2022. The most consistent way to deal with crowded fights is to either vault away or hit each enemy once to soften them up. If this game's platforming is the Uncharted of its time, then its combat is the Arkham Asylum of its time. Thing is, the controls aren't that precise, and vaulting over the wrong enemy type, only to get slapped down, happens way too often. Besides that, the late game strips the prince of his dagger for story purposes. This means that he no longer has a safety net whenever he screws up a platforming challenge. That's not a big deal, to be honest. The checkpointing in this game is so forgiving that you could forego using the rewind function if you wanted for the entire game. That's why the late game is so bad. It highlights how little the rewind function actually matters. Sure, it's nice and convenient to undo your little mistake here and there, but again, the very generous checkpointing makes a lack of rewind feel trivial. Also, as much as I love Farah and the prince, the vizier is non-existent for 90% of the game. The final battle with him is pretty lame, but that goes for every other boss in this game, which means that the two bosses this game has are boring. But at least we know where Assassin's Creed got the idea for its final boss fight. I still love Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, but now I can look at it and acknowledge its flaws. I still think this game is worth playing through at least once to see how good Ubisoft used to be back in the day. I can't not recommend the upcoming remake as it's still an unknown, but I can recommend getting the Prince of Persia trilogy on Steam. I'm sure there's a way to get a controller working on the GOG versions, but Steam's community provides really good controls that are easy to map, and it's like I'm playing the game on PS2 all over again. Sometimes, it's good to look back at old favorites and remember why they're your favorites. Sometimes, it's good to remember when a developer like Ubisoft knew how to make fun and memorable games.